good day and good morning, friends and viewers, to our weekly Straight Talk program. I would like to welcome you once again to these programs, which have been of great interest to many inside and outside Guyana. Of course, we have said this before, but it's important for us to repeat it in order for us to let people know how the responses have been to our program. This week, we're going to speak about an issue that has attracted worldwide attention, international attention that has drawn thousands, if not millions, of people to the events that took place in the country which I'm about to refer to. It is important that we speak, discuss, and analyze these developments because they mean a lot to other countries as well as ours. The experiences of countries outside of Guyana are important for us to take lessons from. And in the country that I will refer to just now, having regard to the events that took place just a few weeks ago, it would seem to me that there are some fundamental lessons, some fundamental experiences that we could draw upon in order to ensure that when making an analysis of what is happening in our own country, in our own backyard, so to speak, we understand fully the implications of what has taken place. I would wish to discuss this week the events that has taken place or that took place in a country called Bolivia. Bolivia is a South American country. We in Guyana are also on the continent of South America. Some would say that we have a continental destiny. That was a matter that was debated ever since the days of Dr. Jagan. And notwithstanding the fact that we are on the continent of South America and is known as a South American country, traditionally, culturally, and historically, we are to a large extent linked to the English-speaking Caribbean. Common culture, common history, and so many things in common that link us to CARICOM, as we call it. But let us focus on South America. South America has been a continent that is usually in upheaval. There have always been military coups and counter-coups, dictatorships, fighting and struggling for democracy, fascist rules like they had in Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay many years ago. And that was in a previous era. Now, we are in a completely different era where such incidents, such occurrences do not take place. Or, to put it more precisely, it's much more difficult to occur in Latin America. Guyana, being part of Latin America, has taken steps to be involved in many of the organization and institutional arrangements within the continent. We have acceded to Mercosur. We are in a number of other organizations on the continent of South America. The list is long. But the fact of the matter is that because of where we are geographically and because of the new era in which we are working and new areas of foreign policy that has opened up, it behoves Guyana to be part of the developments, foreign policy initiatives, institutional and organizational arrangements within the continent as a whole. And so Guyana has always sought, while maintaining its traditional relations with CARICOM, it has always sought to strengthen its relations with Latin American countries. Many presidents from Latin America have visited Guyana, especially those who were democratically elected. And the Guyanese people are known for their hospitality in welcoming many of the presidents that came here over the years since independence in 1966. So Latin America has been a continent that is always, I should say always, but it's not unusual for Latin America to be in turmoil. It's a restless continent. But it has made strides over the years. Many of the regimes that were dictatorial or fascist have now gone into the dustbin of history. A new wave of democracy has dawned in Latin America. And all of this is because of, one, changes in the international or the global situation, as well as the new developments that have taken place in the countries themselves, growing awareness of the people in those countries who are continuing the fight for better living conditions, better working conditions, and a new way of life. So let us focus for this purpose on the question of Bolivia and Guyana. We want to examine the developments of Bolivia, or within that country, through the eyes of a Guyanese. We want to establish what is called linkage between the developments in Bolivia and what has transpired or what has been transpiring in Guyana over the past months. By the way, let me make this point. There are some people, and I'm not being critical of anyone, there are some people who believe that we should not discuss these matters. They believe that we must focus only on Guyana. But you know, there's a saying that no man is an island. And there's something that's called globalization. All countries of the world are interconnected, are interrelated. In fact, if you look at many of the products that are being imported in Guyana today, there are a huge number of products that are being imported from South America into our country. Only the other day, I was looking at a tin of evaporated milk that's being imported from Peru. I was surprised. But on the other hand, it's a reality that that globalization and international trade have opened up borders of countries, allowing them to trade freely with each other, of course, taking into account other regional arrangements which they may be in, for example, in the case of Guyana and CARICOM. So, Guyana and Bolivia have many things in common. First of all, Bolivia is basically the smallest country in Latin America after Paraguay. But Bolivia is what is called a landlocked country. It has no access to the sea, it has no access to the oceans, it has no access to water, so to speak. And because it is a landlocked country, which came about as a result of a war between Chile and Bolivia many centuries ago, Bolivia has always been seeking to have access to the sea. And the recently elected president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, took the matter to the International Court of Justice in the same way that Guyana has taken Venezuela's claim or the controversy with Venezuela to the International Court of Justice. On the one hand, Bolivia took their case to the International Court of Justice, what we call the ICJ, asking the court to rule on the need for Chile to sit and negotiate with Bolivia access to the sea. In the case of Guyana, Guyana is taking its case to the International Court of Justice, deeming Venezuela's claim to Guyana's territory to be illegitimate, totally unfounded, and without merit whatsoever. Now the court pronounced on Bolivia's case and did not rule in favor of Bolivia. Unfortunately for Bolivia, they lost that case. The court ruled that it has no jurisdiction to instruct Chile to sit with Bolivia to negotiate access to the sea. This was a serious setback for the government because they had built up the expectations that a solution was at hand. Unfortunately, this was not to be. In our case, we are still awaiting the Caribbean Court of Justice to deliberate and eventually to pronounce on the matter that Guyana has taken to the court. So here they are again, here they are, we can see immediately some similarities, not exactly the same insofar as territorial issues are concerned between these two countries. Guyana has borders with Suriname, Venezuela, Brazil, and the Atlantic Ocean. Some people would forget that the Atlantic Ocean is one of our neighbors. So we have borders with Brazil, Suriname, Venezuela, and the Atlantic. We have a population of approximately 780,000 people. In the case of Bolivia, they have borders with 5 countries: Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Peru. In addition to that, what makes their situation even more difficult is that they are landlocked. In other words, they're locked in by land without having any access to the sea. And we've spoken about what are the implications of that. Now, there has been in Bolivia a president by the name of Evo Morales who established a party called the Movement Towards Socialism. Now, the moment this word socialism is introduced in the present international dispensation, it rings alarm bells. But every country, as we know, according to the United Nations Charter, had the right to determine which direction it would wish to go and on which path, which social and economic and political path it may wish to go. In other words, the right of people to self-determination, to determine the direction which they would like to go. Elections were held recently in Bolivia, but the elections were deemed fraudulent. Before the elections, however, a referendum was held because the president, Mr. Morales, was seeking a 4th term in office. The result of the referendum was that the people rejected him having a 4th term in office. But he took the matter to the Constitutional Court, and the court ruled in his favor that he could have a 4th term in office. So that was the first problem that started to develop. Elections were held, and those elections, there were allegations that the elections were rigged. Apart from the fact there were allegations that the elections were rigged, there were some other charges against the government, such as corruption, that they were giving out licenses or contracts to Chinese companies to explore and exploit what is called a lithium resources, a very important natural resource. And in addition to that, the government under Mr. Morales had nationalized the oil and gas industries, which were foreign owned. But apart from those steps, Bolivia, under the president or the government that was just removed from office, had taken approximately 3 million people out of poverty. Remember I said the population is about 11.5 million. And within the 3 terms of office, within 12 years, 3 million people were taken out of poverty. Bolivia became the fastest growing economy in Latin America. And they were known in the national arena for taking very advanced position on the question of climate change. One of the negative aspects, however, which many countries did not agree with, was the cultivation and exportation of coca that is used to produce cocaine. Although this was being done legally and within the laws of the country. So after these elections were held and deemed as fraudulent, the opposition demanded that an audit be held of the elections. You recall in 1997, when Janet Jagan was elected president of the country, the then opposition PNC rejected the results and demanded that an audit be held. The CARICOM was called upon by both government and opposition in Guyana to carry out the audit. The audit was done, and the audit proved that there was no fraud in the elections, as was being claimed by the then PNC. So audits are positive, audits are to be welcome, especially if you want to get rid, so to speak, of the allegations that the elections were rigged. So we had experience in Guyana with an elections audit. That was done by CARICOM. In the case of Bolivia, an audit was done by the Organization of American States of the elections in Bolivia. Even with the question of an audit, there has been controversy. Some are saying that no evidence was actually presented by the OAS to show that there were specific areas of fraud, other than a general statement to the effect that the results cannot be validated and therefore the OAS was not in a position to say the elections were free and fair. Let's go to Guyana. A no confidence motion was passed on December 21st, 2018 in the National Assembly. December 21st, 18 in the a no confidence motion was passed on December 21st, 2018 in the National Assembly. The government was deemed illegal. The Constitution deemed the government a fall. And the Constitution pointed out what are the steps that are required to be taken in order for elections to be held in 3 months. So on the one hand, you had controversy in Bolivia on the question of elections. On the other hand, you had in Guyana no confidence motion being passed. According to the Constitution, elections to be held in 3 months and a new government elected. But that controversy dragged on. In the case of Guyana, went through the courts. International pressure was exerted, no doubt about that, from the Commonwealth, from the OAS, from the United States, from Canada, from Britain, sorry, not Canada, from Britain. Canada did not make any statement on the matter. But the point of the matter is that international pressure was exerted on the government to name a date for elections as soon as possible. But the pressure that was exerted on the APNU-AFC government was not the kind of pressure that was exerted on the Bolivian government. The pressure that was exerted on the Bolivian government was both at the international and the domestic level. And that pressure was for the government to resign. So, from holding an election that was deemed rigged to the position of an audit, which was held, and further, the president had said that fresh elections would be held as soon as possible, and that the Bolivian Elections Commission would be entirely revamped, the officials removed, and a new commission established. Now here we see some similarities with Guyana also. Prior to 1992, when the elections were free and fair in this country, the entire Elections Commission had to be revamped, and a new commission was put in place called GCOM with a new chairman and new commissioners. This is what the president of Bolivia was seeking to do in his country, and this is what was demanded by the opposition. But here's the thing. The demands moved from an audit to a new elections commission to regime change, that the government must go. And coupled with that demand, there were protests and demonstrations in the streets of La Paz and many of the main cities of Bolivia. Violence, looting, beating up of people supporting the government, and so forth. We had that experience here in Guyana in the 60s, when attempts were made, pressure were exerted both internally and externally, the PNC, along with the external forces. Pressure was exerted to remove the Jagan government from office before independence. So here again we see some similarities in respect of how to get rid of governments that are of a particular inclination. So it's not that the Bolivian government refused to hold fresh elections and to change the elections commission in their country. They agreed to that, but that was not sufficient for the opposition. They then moved to the government must go. Here in Guyana, with the passage of the no confidence motion and the going through the motions in the courts, we still find the same government that should have resigned 3 months after the no confidence motion was passed, still in the government. Why? Because there was not sufficient external pressures and internal pressures to get rid of these people, remove them from office. In the meantime, the corruption continues, the government continues to be illegal, they continue to trample on the Constitution, and many violations of the rule of law. Herein lies the difference between what transpired in Bolivia and what transpired in Guyana. You must draw your conclusions. So on November the 10th, having regard to the internal situation in Bolivia, the military intervened and told the president of the country that, boy, it's better you go because you can have problems in the country. And that it's better you go because we can't guarantee your life. Could you imagine that? The military and the police telling the president and his cabinet that it's better they leave the country because their lives, their protection cannot be guaranteed. When these are the institutions that are expected to uphold the Constitution and ensure the safety and protection of the president and government ministers. That did not occur. And so there's this big controversy, a big debate that is taking place now internationally, whether there was a coup, that is to say a military coup on November 10th, or whether there was the forced removal of the government, resulting also in the president of Bolivia traveling to Mexico in order to take up exile in that country. Here in Guyana, the government, APNU AFC, continues to squat in office. They've announced a date for elections. But in the meantime, while they've announced a date for the elections, they continue with their shenanigans on a day-to-day basis. Many people are anxious for the elections to be held. And they're only anxious to see the back of the government, as we have said on this program before. So when you examine the situation in Bolivia through the prism or through the eyes of Guyana, you see a number of similarities, and you see a number of warning signs that we ought to take cognizance of. We are not saying that it will happen in Guyana. All we are saying is take note of these developments and be vigilant, be on the alert, because none of us have a crystal ball in order to determine what can happen before or after March the 2nd, 2020. Now with the new arrangements, governmental or administrative, we don't know what to call it, arrangements in place in Bolivia, because we're hearing that the individual who has now taken over the reins of government have done so illegally and not in accordance with the Constitution of Bolivia. We understand that Parliament has been convened in a way that it ought not to be convened. We understand that the individual who convened Parliament does not have the authority to do so. We understand that some sessions have been held in the Parliament without a quorum, without enough persons. And we further understand that many members of Parliament and members of the Senate, because they have an upper house and a lower house in the Bolivian situation, a Congress and a Senate. We understand that many of the government-supported MPs are being harassed, the houses are being burnt to the ground, some are being imprisoned, some are being kidnapped and cannot be accounted for, and so forth. So a change has come to Bolivia with the forced removal of the government and with a new dispensation in place in that South American country. But what has the change brought? What has been the means to the end? And does the end justify the means? We, of course, have to be concerned about this, as I said, because there's a whole saying that coming events cast their shadows. And I wish to reiterate that it is not a question of being prophets of doom and gloom. It's a question of intelligently and scientifically, as best as we can, analyzing the situation and trying our best to intelligently anticipate, knowing the track record of the PNC, the major partner in the APNU, knowing their track record, their past track record, or their past rap sheet, so to speak. We know what they're capable of. And the worst thing we can do in this country is to be politically naive and to say all things are bright and beautiful when we know that the reality tells a different story. So there are many questions that have been left unanswered. Who will be the beneficiaries of the change in Bolivia? Again, in the same way, we have seen who have been the beneficiaries of the change in Guyana. Now, it is true that the government has recently given a huge increase to public servants in Guyana. And nobody should be opposed to that. But in the same way that they have increased salaries, etc., for public servants and everyone else that will benefit, we have to take cognizance of the fact that there are many in Guyana, many pockets of poverty in the country that the government has to address. Question of the sugar workers and many others. So while that is to be welcomed on the one hand, on the other, we also have to look at the situation in respect of other citizens of the country who are in need of help. So, change for change's sake, change without substance, change for whose benefit. These are the questions that we have to ponder. These are the questions we have to consider when we are examining the situation, as I said, in this case, Bolivia and Guyana. You have in Bolivia an illegal government or an illegal institutional arrangement. In Guyana, you also have an illegal government in place, waiting for elections to be held next year. So, in this kind of situation, what do we do? In the same way that we are in Guyana demanding a return to democracy, in the same way that we are demanding free and fair elections, in the same way that we are demanding that free and fair elections should result in a new government that will help to alleviate the problems of the people. That is the same demands that is being made in the context of Bolivia. People are demanding that fresh elections be held as soon as possible in Bolivia in order to deal with this present crisis. That there should be there should be an end to the political harassment, the victimization, the beating up of people, the burning of properties, and so forth. Fortunately, we haven't gone to that extent in terms of our political crisis in the country. So we want a restoration of democracy based on free and fair elections being held, as has been announced on March the 2nd next year. In the same way, the Bolivians are calling for that. Elections as soon as possible, a new government to be elected, return to normalcy, and an end to the present situation that they have in that country as well. My friends, it all boils down to another fundamental question. What is the kind of economic model a government wishes to pursue? Under Dr. Jagan set the PPP on a particular course. A free market economy based on a trisectoral economy. State, private, and cooperative sectors. Trisectoral economy. In other words, three sectors must be influencing the growth of the economy. The public sector, the private sector, and the cooperative sector. Well, unfortunately, the cooperative sector in this country is not as robust as it should be. And so it is basically the state and the private sector that are the engines of growth in the country. Public sector, from the point of view of investment, PSIP, what is called public sector investment programs, and the private sector in terms of investments in various sectors of the economy. foreign investments as well, as we notice is happening in some areas, particularly in oil and gas. And so, when we sit and watch our television programs, and we see what is happening in other countries, we should not say with due respect that those things are totally unrelated to Guyana. The world is one. We live in a globalized world. We live in a world where trade is developing, or free trade is developing at a rapid pace. We live in a world where people are now free to travel as easily as they can. And so to take the position that, oh, we don't want to hear about what's happening in Bolivia. We don't want to hear what's happening in America. We don't want to hear what's happening in Canada. We want to hear only what's happening in Guyana. That's not a correct position to take. You're free to take those positions, of course. That's your personal position. Nobody can argue with that. But, at times it's important for us to have a wider vision. It's important for us to take all factors into account, what is happening in Guyana or what is happening outside of Guyana, because in the final analysis, even though Bolivia and these events might seem remote, thousands of miles away from us, there is what is called a global or international trend. And one can never know. There's a saying, never be surprised by the unexpected. We never know to what extent it can impact on us here in Guyana. The struggle for free and fair elections is linked to the struggle for free and fair elections in other countries. The struggle for democracy in Guyana is linked to the struggle of democracy in other countries. The struggle to maintain the rule of law in Guyana is linked to the struggle for the maintenance for the rule of law in other countries. And that is why we must be able to appreciate the struggle of those people in those countries who are fighting for the same issues that we're fighting for, something that is called solidarity. We may need the solidarity of people sometime in the future. One never knows. But every time we base and discuss these questions, we obviously have to look at our own national interests. We have to protect our national interests. But in doing so, in protecting our national interests, we also have to look at the interests of countries that have common interests with us as well. Take, for example, our border issues. If Guyana had not taken our controversy with Venezuela internationally, we could not have come this far. Many countries are now in support of Guyana's position on the question of the controversy with Venezuela. It was during my tenure as the Minister of Foreign Affairs that the initiative was taken to set up the Commonwealth Group on the question of Guyana's Guyana's position on the question of the controversy with Venezuela. So international support is important, but we cannot be selfish. We cannot only want international support when we have a problem. We must also be able to give international support when peoples in other countries have similar problems like ours, as I pointed out just now. So listeners, I appeal to you to have an open mind on these questions, to see the linkage between these issues that we have spoken about and other issues in other countries, and to always take into consideration events in other countries and to look at them in the context of our own situation here in Guyana. Once we do that, we'll be able to better understand and appreciate what we are doing here and what other people are doing in other countries. This is extremely important for us. On that note, I wish to thank you for listening. There are many lessons to be learned on the experience that has taken place in Bolivia And I'm sure there are many people outside who are also taking note of our situation here in Guyana and recognizing that there are lessons to be learned from the situation in our country as well. Thank you. Until next time, it was a pleasure having you on board.